everyone, and welcome to another Trial Site News interview. I'm your host, Brandon, and today we'll be talking to David Dickson, an ex-law enforcement officer in the UK who is now an IT security consultant in Alberta, Canada. Mr. Dickson is an international privacy advocate, cybersecurity consultant, and former law enforcement professional. He attended the University of Cumbria and ended up residing in Alberta, Canada, as mentioned previous. David has been on a mission to expose various forms of illicit examples of egregious state overreach during the pandemic, often manifesting as cases of what Officer Dickson cites as forms of illegal and corrupt practices. David caught Trial Site News' attention as we were on his email distribution list, and we are covering his continuous efforts to expose government corruption linked to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Our topic today is Mr. Dickson's ongoing personal investigation in the COVID-19 excess deaths. Is there a link to government policy and practice? Mr. Dickson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning or afternoon. You.
I'd like to start with your background. We know you were a police officer in the UK for at least a decade, from the mid-1980s through the mid-1990s. Can you share with us just a little bit about that and how you transitioned from the law enforcement to security and privacy consulting?
So I joined Merseyside Police, which is Liverpool for most people, where the Beatles are from, mid-80s. Started off as just a general constable. Did training specifically in forensic investigation. I'm a trained forensic at CSI, most people in America would call them. Also a trained firefighter, police support unit, trained first aider. So things like masks use and that sort of stuff, I'm considered an expert in. As my time went on as a police officer, I started doing a lot of research work, specifically across the country. Ended up being awarded one of the only 17 constables ever to have been awarded a research award, internationally recognized for my research work. Sadly, towards the end of my career, which is going very well at the time, I was injured on duty. So I had to leave the force. At that time, I'd actually been considering looking at transferring over to Canada and becoming a police officer over here, but because of my injury, I wasn't able to do that. So instead, I moved to Canada and set up an IT company, specializing specifically in government work, policing, justice, privacy, compliance, and forensic investigations. Since I left the police, I've done forensic investigations for the City of London, for the Mayor's office, for a fraud investigation, which I conducted actually, ironically, from over here in Canada, and many other things. I've worked on some major law enforcement and justice projects. I'm considered in Canada the leading expert in electronic disclosure and digital evidence for the courts. I developed the system that the Canadian police forces and justice systems use for their disclosure in criminal files. I've also done security audits, threat risk assessments for the national security data centers here in Canada. Yeah, it was all that background that when we came to 2019, beginning of 2020, I had to use every single one of those skills I'd developed over time to start tracking what was going on. As a police officer in the UK during the 80s, I was familiar with the sort of response we were going through. This idea of isolating healthy people is not something that is unknown to particularly NATO countries. It's actually a specific response plan for World War III. ironically. Pandemic response plans don't normally isolate healthy people, but our response to a global threat from a foreign body actually is to isolate healthy people. That was something that was developed back during the Cold War. And I was a little bit horrified to see us rolling that out in response to a pandemic coronavirus. So luckily at that time, I still had some connections back with my colleagues in the armed forces and the security services. And I asked them at the beginning of 2020, am I actually seeing countries respond with this plan? And the answer I got back was yes. And then I said, okay, then I need to start tracking everything that happens from this point on, because this is about to go horribly wrong. And it did, sadly.
So you just answered my next question of, what did you observe in Alberta that first got you concerned about the legality of government actions? I think you just touched upon that. So I'm gonna jump right into the excess deaths in Canada. You've been publishing material about that. We've been tracking excess deaths in multiple nations. In Alberta, can you summarize your research and findings? And if you could discuss the methodology used to track excess deaths?
Yeah, so there are effectively two data sources for all-cause mortality and then broken down into excess deaths, which is the all-cause mortality, which goes above what would be expected to be seen in a given year and or week. Depending on which country you're in or which location you're in, that information is published either weekly, monthly, or in some cases, it can take up to 2 years for us to publish some of that data. With the coming of COVID, we started getting partial data almost on a daily basis, just about everywhere in the world. One of the things that sort of disturbed me in Alberta is I'm looking at the data worldwide for reported COVID deaths. I'm watching what's happening here in Alberta, and suddenly we initiated on the 12th of March a lockdown of sorts. No groups more than 250 people were allowed to get together because of what they were telling us were deaths and a high level of COVID cases. I checked the published data, and we didn't have anything outside of this one dashboard, which was only publishing COVID data. So I started downloading that and analyzing it. And what was being told to us daily on the news didn't match what was being published by the government in their daily updates. The government of Alberta published data broken down by actual individual case. So they have a row item of where a person died in any of the 5 regions around, north, south, central, etc. in the province, their age range, whether they were male or female. And then from that data, you could then match that against what was being reported by the news, because they would obviously report, an 80-year-old man died yesterday of COVID. So I started watching that data, and it was over time, we seemed to be reacting to something that there wasn't as many deaths to sort of trigger this. So I then looked at what the policy was, what they actually instituted as a state of emergency, which was then on the 17th of March. And we declared in Alberta a pandemic influenza emergency. Now, if anybody had said pandemic influenza for the first 2 years of COVID, you were told it's not influenza, you can't call it influenza. So I was a little bit confused as to how we triggered the state of emergency for pandemic influenza when our influenza cases weren't anything unusual. And that was because we didn't have the mechanism in law to declare a pandemic for anything other than influenza. So they just decided that, even though they had no legislative authority for it, to declare that state of emergency. Then I looked at how many deaths we were reporting, and Alberta was reporting one set of data, And then federally, all the data that Health Canada gets comes from the provinces. So the data should match. There may be some lagging in reporting, but the data should match. And I noticed the data wasn't matching exactly. So that was disturbing. So over, particularly over 2020, I tracked how many cases we were getting and then compared that to the all-cause mortality data. And something didn't add up. We were over-reporting cases. We were over-reporting all-cause mortality, and that's continued. And as time's gone on, it's become very clear that the data's been manipulated. In Alberta, in our daily updates, there's two data sets that we were getting. One was a chart, which you could pull the data from, and another one was an actual download file of the individual breakdown of deaths and cases, and also recoveries. So they initially were reporting when a person recovered. That would go onto the data set. So you could see how many active cases we had. By the end of March, there was a press conference. We'd been locked down for our 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And they reported 29 COVID deaths in the province and 486 active COVID cases, less 27 recoveries. Now, that was enough to terrify everybody and to allow them to continue their restrictions. Over time, I watched this data, and then when we got into 2021, I noticed that the government was saying X amount of people vaccinated were in hospital and X amount of people unvaccinated were in hospital. And they based that by resetting their counter of data on the 1st of January 2021. And they were saying they had, say, 700 deaths in 2021, of which 600 and odd were unvaccinated. And it was like, so the majority of people who were going in hospital were unvaccinated. I was like, but that number didn't add up, because we'd had 2,500 excess deaths reported by that point. Sorry, 2,500 COVID deaths reported by that point. But they were saying we'd only had 700 and odd in 2021. I was like, okay, well, that means we've actually had to have had over 1,500 deaths in 2020 from COVID. But the data says we only had 1,046. So we had, effectively, we had 485 deaths that were missing from one set of reporting, one narrative, which was what your risk factor would be being vaccinated or not, as opposed to how many people were dying. So I tried then to reconcile that with a few different data sources, and it took a while. I asked the government for clarification. You know, you're reporting a certain amount of data. Where is that data? And I said it could come down to just one simple thing. The date that you've put in the data set, if you say that is the date a person was recorded as COVID, then it means one thing. But if you say it's the date they died, it means something else. So just by sorting the data, you could get two different numbers. Eventually in 2023, I got that answer from our health minister. He said, don't look at that data, that's wrong. Look at this data. And he gave me a different data set. And I said, okay, well, this is even worse, because in March, when you said there'd been 29 deaths, the data now says there was only one. And that was a probable death, not an actual confirmed death. And the amount of cases you said, which was 486 active cases, we actually had one. That's in the new data set. So what you're saying now is that you called a state of emergency with no evidence whatsoever to support calling a state of emergency. And that resulted in the lockdown of care homes across the province, people losing their businesses, and a lot of people having surgeries cancelled and dying. I then cross-referenced that with the Health Canada data, and Health Canada data was still saying 1,046 deaths for 2020. And Health Canada's data said that all the way till August of 2022, when I actually brought it to the attention of the health minister in Canada. saying, we've got something going on here that is clearly Alberta is manipulating data or Health Canada's manipulating data. One of you is, because you can't report two different sets of deaths when you're both supposed to be working from the same data source. And with, with a 50% difference in the number of deaths, that's significant. Right after that, Health Canada's data changed. And they didn't match, but for a year, they got closer. Then later in 2023, Health Canada reset their data again, and it now matches. In fact, as of right now, it shows 1,030 deaths in 2020 with COVID, whereas Alberta Health's data, the government of Alberta, says 1,587 deaths with COVID. That is a significant difference. I've been asking for our Justice Minister and our Premier and our Health Minister to meet with me to answer that question, because I mean, it's one thing getting the data wrong and like saying how many people died of cancer in a year, but there's no actual significant consequence that other than just a statistical report. If they're out a little bit in those deaths, doesn't matter. But when highly restrictive policies that themselves have caused suffering and death are being based on these numbers,
right,
well, you can't get them wrong.
right.
And as time's gone on, it's funny, in Alberta, COVID data, we get reported every week now. But all-cause mortality takes 2 years for them to update. So we're 2 years behind. If you ask somebody at Alberta Health or in the government, how many people, how many ill-defined and unknown cause, so deaths where they can't put a number on them, for 2021, they'll say there was 3,600, give or take. Health Canada says there's 640 for that same year.
Well, that's what I wanted to jump into. Actually, you're leading right into, I reviewed your report dated November 27 of 2023, so about 6 weeks ago. It's on your website, and we'll link that in this video. And you just mentioned there's two interesting rows that are listed, and you write on page 7 of this report, and for the people doing the analysis of the report, why are you not screaming about the 103,495 ill-defined and information unavailable deaths in the data for 2023? How can we still have that many unspecified causes of mortality?
So, yeah, this came about because I report the data from the direct source. I was surprised when the November 27 Stats Canada report came out, and it was quoting that in 2022, Canada reported 16,000, give or take, 16,043, I think it was, ill-defined and unknown cause deaths. That's a high number for being more than a year old. What people don't really understand, and what was frustrating for me, was watching all these quote unquote experts and doctors and the media analyzing that report and saying, all these people, we don't know how they died. How can, they've put and it's like, no, there's a lagging in the reporting. That is a sort of a catchment area for deaths where they have to report them within a certain timeline, but then this certain number of deaths may be going through coroner's reports and such like. So some of them take time to recover. So that number should get smaller over time. Even so, 16,000 was excessive after a year. I mean, reporting in November that the 2022 data was still at 16,000. So I go back and it was like, that number doesn't make sense to me, because I check this data all the time. 16,000 isn't a number that I recognize. So I would go back to the source data, and the number's actually 10,000. It's not 16,000. And I'm thinking, okay, so people just don't understand how the lagging of the reporting works. So then I looked at 2023, and I find that Ontario, our biggest province with our biggest number of deaths, has, although they've reported over 62,000 deaths in the first half of the year for 2023, they haven't reported a single cause of death, not one. So for 2.5 years, they knew about every single person who died from COVID within 24 hours and reported it daily on the TV. But for a whole year, they haven't got a clue who died, what anybody died of in 2023, including the people who died of COVID, because at the very least, you would have expected to see the COVID numbers reported in that data. But in the Health Canada data, they have nothing. And when we start looking at the other provinces, they are also reporting excessive numbers in this ill-defined category. What was more disturbing is the ill-defined is one that you would expect things to be in temporarily and then moved into their appropriate category later. There's one area that shouldn't have any data in at the Health Canada level. It should have been resolved before it got to Health Canada. And that's the no information available.
Right.
Well, that one has the majority of that data. There's 96,000 deaths in that category, 103,000 overall with the ill-defined. And I was avoiding the November 27th report because I knew it wasn't accurate and I had more accurate data, but because it was getting so much attention online, I decided, okay, I'll do a full analysis of it and point out, at which point I'm thinking to myself, well, anybody who's looking at this data and analyzing it, if they are upset about 16,000 in that unknown category, why is nobody screaming about 103? Bearing in mind, that's nearly a third of all deaths in Canada for 2023. We have no cause of death for. And we're now at the end of, that report was written on the 27th of November it was with the November data, so it was 1 month out, but there wasn't that much change because of the way the most provinces are still lagging. Manitoba, for example, which is one of our bigger provinces, their last data was reported they're missing 2 weeks of data from 2022, let alone and they've got no data at all for 2023. The Yukon hasn't reported any death data since 2016. And this is what's, for me as a forensic analyst, is what's frustrating, is the amount of people that are doing these, experts that are doing these analysis of the data and failing to point out how much data is missing, how much data is mischaracterized.
Right.
And, even between, in the one table that the report actually refers to 36 different tables over 10 million rows of data, and nobody's looked at any of it. It's quite clear from every analysis I've looked at, including the people who wrote the report, because the report has a table in it which references a data source that doesn't have any of the data that's in that table. That's like, these are, to me, again, because I look at it as although I'm retired, I still look at things as a police officer, and it's like these are glaring issues. Just anybody looking at it says, okay, well, it's got a link there to the data source. I click on that link. None of the data that's in the table on this page is in that data source. You would normally, pre-COVID, that would immediately have the media phoning Health Canada and saying, or Stats Canada and saying, we've got a problem with this report. What's going on? Instead of that, we have the media spinning a narrative of, oh, it's all these unknown causes, which we're going to put down to, it was probably COVID. And it's not. The reality is, COVID numbers are, even where they've tried to make them COVID, and the definition, like in most places in the world, of a COVID death is very tenuous at best.
Right.
And it makes the reporting of any data, I typically try to avoid, other than that ill-defined group, I typically try to avoid the breakdowns of data, like how many people have died of a heart attack, because of, excuse me, the way they record COVID deaths. We've obscured a lot of heart attacks, cancers, even suicides and other types of death by marking them down as COVID. They don't go into multiple categories. If there's been a COVID test or there's been somebody with a COVID symptom, in the UK, it's any time within 28 days. In Alberta here, it was originally any time within 6 months of a COVID test. And the way they act, and I've got the internal communications where they told everybody would assume that COVID deaths were defined by a doctor. In Alberta, and same in the UK, it was actually the statistical department that decided what a COVID death was. They would actually look up the health record, and if COVID was listed in their health record within a certain period of time, they became a COVID death unless, I mean, if somebody died in a car crash and was decapitated and they had a death certificate, they would exclude that data. I mean, there were some things that were excluded. There were some that got through, even with that. But it was effectively, and here in Alberta, it was a nurse asking a database analyst to run a report for them, and then they would decide who died of COVID based on this nebulous criteria of if somebody died within 6 months of a COVID diagnosis, which, as I say, could be as simple as somebody having a runny nose that they didn't expect, and they just got tagged in the database as a COVID case. That then became COVID. In August of 2022, they issued an update to that, and it's still the case as of today. A COVID death is defined as anybody who dies within 60 days of being diagnosed with COVID for whatever reason. In the same way as a COVID hospitalization is anybody who went to hospital within 30 days of being diagnosed with COVID, and they stay as a COVID hospitalization for 2 weeks after they've been discharged. So, I mean, the numbers are, and again, these numbers, when they're just statistics, and I've done a lot of statistical work for the government, when they're just used to justify budgets and other things, I mean, they're wrong, but people's lives don't depend on it. When you're actually defining policy that, as happens currently in Alberta, if a care home resident has a runny nose or coughs, they will be, even today here in 2024, they will be force isolated in their room for 10 days. If they refuse to wear a mask, they have to spend an additional 10 days where they don't leave the room. They're not showered. They're not properly cared for, unless they're a smoker. And then they can come and go as they please. They can be fully symptomatic, fully tested positive, and they can leave their room and come and go as they please, as they've been able to do throughout the whole of COVID. But if they're not a smoker, they are literally locked in their room with no proper treatment, and they die. And we have, and that's based on this lie, because without the data, without the manipulation of the data, none of this could have happened. Right. And as of, as I've pointed out to our Premier here and our Health Minister, and I've been promised a meeting with our Justice Minister for 3 months now, and they just keep stalling. Yeah. And it's like, we are, our COVID vaccine rollout program, which is still going on, without informed consent, is based on this risk factor of this data that it's not even close to reality. Right. At every level. And at every level, there seems to be a manipulation done to fit a specific narrative. It's quite clear when you look at what is being said in every country. It's the data is being put together to fit a narrative. The response is not being put together to fit a reality. And that's where it then becomes criminal because, in fact, technically in Canada, it would fit the definition of terrorism, which the government can be guilty of. Effectively, if you terrorize a population into undertaking medical or other types of changes to their general day-to-day living, and you do that to any portion of the population, it actually meets the definition of terrorism, which, again, what's probably the most disturbing about it all is all of this information is actually out there in the public domain.
Yeah.
They're not even trying to hide it. It's not hard to actually find the lies. And as a retired police officer, that's what probably disturbs me the most is I know my colleagues know this.
Yep.
They're not stupid.
It's the same as the US here with the,
Yep.
the reporting systems, the VAERS and our other reporting databases. We've have the same, similar information. It's out there in the public. I was going to ask about communication you've had, and you've already answered some of that on the communication you've had with government officials. So I guess to wrap up, do you have any patterns, anything that you've been able to validate from this data on what would explain all of these excess deaths that are being listed as unreported? And as a part B of that has that been validated by any third-party validation?
So I analyze the data across the world, and I've also throughout this monitored the legislative responses, the physical responses in every country, and tracked how each one of those things has correlated to the all-cause deaths. And they can manipulate the all-cause deaths by putting them into different categories, but they can't really manipulate the top number other than this delay. They can do some lagging in the reporting, but that's quite obvious to see where there's, in fact, week 52. I've just done week 52 for England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and we can see that there's a lag in week 52. It's quite obvious from the data. But overall, you can't really change that much as to when we've seen deaths with the way they've been reporting them. So I look at 2020, and I'd started to look at this right at the very beginning, and it was one of my biggest indicators was COVID. If COVID's what's killing everybody, if it is as deadly as it is, then we know that it was circulating everywhere way before the first lockdown. Way before any restrictions were put in place, we had lots and lots of circulation. Wuhan is sort of the hub for just about everything you buy at Christmas comes out of Wuhan, China. It's one of the most traveled areas, particularly in the run up to Christmas. So I looked at all the data prior in 2019 into 2020, and we had what we'd call a bad cold and flu season as far as infections, but not as far as deaths. In fact, in most countries, I track the data up to the end of March, and there are no excess deaths at all. Our deaths are where we'd expect them for all causes for a flu season. And in fact, in a lot of countries, it was starting to trend down. 2019 to 2020 was looking like a low number. Immediately after that, when our first lockdown started, and you can track it by country and by province, the spike in excess deaths or the spike in all-cause mortality for any reason starts at mid to late March, beginning of April, depending on when places lock down. It's very clear, and even the investigations that have been happening in the UK and in Scotland and in England have confirmed, and we have an Auditor General's report here in Alberta, have confirmed the majority of deaths happened in care homes. Because I have a mother-in-law who's in a care home, and because I've been so deeply connected with all of this, and my wife is actually a basically a support person for a number of people in care homes across the province. We've seen the inside, and what we saw was people in 2020 were not dying initially from influenza-like illnesses such as COVID or flu. In fact, we had a dip in that number up until the end of the year. But across the world, and Sweden is a very good example of that, we saw a huge spike in deaths in care homes. And those deaths have been forensically confirmed to primarily have been caused by the response. So in 2020, people were dying, a lot of people were dying in care homes because they were isolated, they were misdiagnosed, they were locked in their rooms, they died of things because they were left in their room because the staff didn't know what to do with them, and they were so busy putting on PPE, they'd be left in their rooms for 24 hours a day, lying in bed or sitting in a chair, not being bathed. Then they develop pressure wounds. Those pressure wounds get infected. They then develop things like osteomyelitis. They decide they're going to be a COVID person at that point, and nobody who had COVID was given antibiotics. So they invariably either died in the care home or they were taken to hospital where they were improperly put on ventilators and, in my opinion, as a police officer, executed. You do not put somebody with an ILI type illness on a ventilator. So in 2020, categorically, the response to COVID and the change in how we actually handled the day-to-day living, particularly in care homes, is what killed the majority of the population. And a lot of people actually sort of start with the vaccine. They start and say, oh, well, people didn't start dying until the vaccine. No, 2020 was a bad year for excess deaths, but there were deaths of people that were pushed over the edge by our response, by locking them up. Now, typically what would happen if that was the case is the following year, because you've killed off a lot of people that would normally have died maybe in the subsequent 3 or 4 years, you would see a drop in excess deaths that next year. We didn't see that. At the end of 2021, again, not in line with the flu season, we saw a spike in excess deaths in the last 2 weeks of 2020. Flu season starts in around October. The deaths were not spiking. They suddenly spiked in the last 2 weeks in almost every single country. And they spiked initially in the elderly and indigenous communities. And then those spikes started to spread by age into the younger groups. You can track those spikes. And it certainly doesn't account for all of them, or all the deaths, because we still had these isolation, all the things that were causing deaths in care homes. That has continued and continues to this day. So there's a percentage of deaths that you can put down to that. And I call them all avoidable deaths because they didn't need to happen. But we have some very specific spikes of deaths that occur with the initial rollout of the vaccine. Then we have another spike with the rollout of the booster and expansion into the older age groups. We have a significant spike in children and infants with the rollout at the end of 2021 into children under the age of 11. That is clearly identifiable. In Alberta, in Canada, we didn't have a single death under the age of 12 attributed to COVID prior to the rollout of the vaccines to that age group. Since the rollout of the vaccines to that age group, with the much milder Omicron that's not supposed to kill as many people, we went from 2 deaths probable under the age of 20 and no deaths under 12 to 67 deaths under the age of 12 and 103 deaths under the age of 20. Correlation is not causation, they say, but as a police officer, I've convicted many, many people due to a preponderance of circumstantial evidence. What we have worldwide is a preponderance of circumstantial evidence that goes beyond mere opinion. It's we can track that. If you only look at one thing, you can say, oh, well, it's age related. That's one of the biggest things is, oh, well, the reason we're getting more deaths in 2023 is because we have an aging population, except the majority of deaths in 2023 are actually happening in the younger age groups. So it's not an aging population that's causing younger people to die. Again, people ask me, can you say for definite this caused this? I can say for definite that we actually have seen safety signals in vaccine adverse event reporting that has never been seen in the history of the world. 1.67 million adverse events reported in the UK, up to 90% of them serious. In Canada, we typically have 135 serious adverse events with every single vaccine that's given in a year. For COVID, we now have 11,500. That to me is, again, as a police officer, I don't look at it as, can I say for definite these things are causing these deaths? I say, do we have enough evidence to actually start a criminal investigation to actually find out exactly what is? Because as I've mentioned, we know the government's manipulating the data. It's clear as day. It's not, it would be hard for them to deny it. And in fact, the health minister here, the previous health minister here, didn't deny it. He said, yeah, that's the wrong data. You need to look at this data. So we have a manipulation of the data sets. We have a lot of people dying that nobody's disputing. And we have adverse events that are off the chart. And in Canada, unlike the VERS data set, where I could actually go onto the VERS data set, I could log onto that website if I've got 20 plus minutes and manually put in an entry for a false report. It would actually, in most cases, be scrubbed after the fact because they do audit them. Same in the UK. They're not left there. There are some obscure ones. If you do a search, you can find the anomalies where people have put a false report in. In Canada, that's not the case. We actually stopped public reporting of adverse events. They shut that system down in Canada at the start of COVID. That was strange. So all the reports we have in Canada, we're talking about 1,000% increase in adverse events, serious adverse events. They're all coming from doctors. To report an adverse event, I put a video together to help a doctor here in Alberta who said, he said, I'm getting people coming to me and I don't know how to report them. I said, okay. It took me an hour's long instructional video to tell him how to report an adverse event. It's not a simple thing to do. So again, we know they're being underreported. We know they're off the charts. We know that deaths are being caused by the response to COVID. That was never justifiable, and that the government is manipulating data. All of those things to me as a police officer say, it's time for the police to come in and actually look and find out what the truth is. Without a true forensic investigation, where data is seized, where people are arrested and questioned under oath, and if necessary, arrests are made, we will never find out the truth. I can give a really good guess as to what has happened, but the reality is, to me, a lot of that is people say, well, who did this? Whose fault is it? Why did they do it? That's something for the post-mortem of what has happened. If we don't stop what's happening, then a lot more people are going to die. And it's still happening. Sadly, for the majority of society, they've been let free now. So they don't pay attention to the fact that care homes are still locked down. Hospitals are still locked down. Masks are still in place. Mandatory vaccinations are still in place in a lot of places. And all against, the CDC says, don't give a flu vaccine and a COVID vaccine at the same time. It increases the likelihood of a severe adverse event within the first 7 days by 11%. Every single country for the XBB vaccine put out a notification saying, get your flu and COVID vaccine at the same time. You can't do that. You can't advise a medical procedure in a mechanism that is guaranteed to cause injuries, and say that's informed consent. That's another area that I am an expert in, internationally recognized as informed consent. We haven't got close to that in anything we've done. So between excess deaths, the vaccinations, the response, the ventilators, any single number of excess deaths, when I look at what the trend was for the 5 years or the 10 years before 2020, we should have been in a downward trend of excess deaths worldwide. So I would put my professional reputation on the line and say, every single excess death we have seen in the last 4 years has been as a direct result of the response to COVID-19, be that the isolations, the improper use of masks, ventilation, midazolam, Versed for people in North America, dilaudid hydromorphone, these respiratory depressing drugs, and various other things. It is the response that has caused the deaths. And until somebody acknowledges that, this will continue. And we do continue to get distracted. Everybody is currently getting really upset about the World Health Organization's power grab, they say. Oh, if we don't stop government signing these documents, then they'll be able to do what? What they've just done for the last 4 years without those documents being signed? I mean, we're putting an awful lot of concern on a piece of paper when we've just watched every single government in the world follow the direction of the World Health Organization, from ventilator use, aerosolizations, mask use, everything else. They did that without a single piece of paper. Right. We all did it, and we're still doing it. Right. So again, and sadly, because the government has lied, and for whatever reason, nobody wants to question them, the courts have got their hands tied, because the courts have decided to do something called judicial notice. And they've told all the judges underneath the Supreme Court in most countries, you will take judicial notice that COVID cases were COVID cases, COVID deaths were COVID deaths. That's not to be questioned. That's just a fact. So if we can actually get through to the courts, if somebody in government, like our Premier here, who knows what the truth is, just said to the police, here's the data set as it really was, and how many people really were sick and dying, as opposed to what we told everyone, that's enough to trigger an investigation. It's enough for judges to start signing off on warrants, and it's enough for us to put an end to this. But it never ends until that happens.
Yeah. Your website has, as I mentioned before, a ton of data, graphs, charts, and we will list this in the description of this video. So David Dickson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
And for unbiased news and opinion articles and the latest in scientific research, please visit trialsitenews.com.
Thank you.